When my nephew suddenly came into my room, I wasn't prepared for what happened next. What do you do when a single moment threatens to unravel everything you've built? That afternoon, I didn't just face an unexpected visitor. I faced a choice that could change my life forever. How does one recover from crossing the line between family and forbidden? Stay tuned to hear the full story of how one knock on the door turned my world upside down. And before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more captivating tales like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The sound of the door creaking open startled me, the faint shuffle of footsteps slicing through the stillness of the afternoon. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned to see him standing there. Stephen, my nephew. His tall frame was backlit by the sunlight streaming in from the hallway, casting his face in shadow, but I could feel his eyes on me, sharp and curious. I scrambled to compose myself, the controller still in my hand as the game's cheerful music blared from the TV screen. "Hey, Aunt Claire," he said casually, his voice deeper than I remembered, almost unfamiliar. He was supposed to be out with his friends. At least that's what he'd told me earlier that morning. But now here he was, catching me completely off guard. "Stephen, you scared me," I exclaimed, trying to sound nonchalant as I set the controller aside and stood. My palms were damp, my breath uneven, though I wasn't sure why. I wiped them on my jeans, forcing a smile. "What are you doing back so early?" He shrugged, stepping further into the room. Plans got canceled. I thought I'd come hang out here for a bit. What are you playing?" His gaze flicked to the TV before settling on me again, a crooked smile tugging at his lips. "Oh, just an old game I used to like," I said, suddenly self-conscious. The scene on the screen, a pastel-colored fantasy world filled with whimsical characters, felt almost too childish now under his scrutinizing stare. I crossed my arms, hoping to block the controller from view, as if that would somehow erase the moment. Davin chuckled softly, the sound warm but laced with something else, something I couldn't quite place. "You're really into it, huh? Didn't mean to interrupt." His tone was easy, but his eyes lingered on me a beat too long. My stomach fluttered, a sensation I quickly buried under a wave of confusion. "It's fine," I replied, moving to turn off the console. "I was just passing the time." "Do you need something?" He leaned against the doorframe, his arms folded across his chest. "No, just wanted to see what you were up to. It's been a while since we've really talked, you know?" The room felt smaller with him standing there, his presence somehow filling every corner. I nodded, trying to ignore the heat rising to my cheeks. "Yeah, I guess it has." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and charged, until finally I cleared my throat and gestured toward the living room. "Well, if you're staying, we can sit and catch up." "Sure," he said, his smile widening as he followed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something unspoken hung in the air between us, something that made my heart race in a way I wasn't ready to confront. As we moved into the living room, I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder. Stephen was taller than I remembered, broader, too, his once boyish face now carrying the sharp angles of a young man. It had been months since his last visit. College kept him busy. But his sudden reappearance today felt oddly significant, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I settled onto the couch, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, while Stephen dropped into the armchair across from me. He stretched out, his long legs sprawled casually, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "So, how've you been?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. Good, I guess, I said finally, though the truth was far more complicated. My days had become a monotonous cycle of cleaning, cooking, and waiting for my husband, Greg, to return from one business trip or another. We had settled into a routine that felt more like cohabitation than a marriage. Stephen's question brought a pang of longing for something I couldn't name. About you, how's school? He grinned, a boyish charm cutting through the seriousness of his gaze. Busy. Professors love to pile on the work, you know, but it's not all bad. I've got a good group of friends. That's good, I said, smiling despite myself. It was easy to fall back into the role of the doting aunt, asking about his classes, his friends, his life. But even as the conversation flowed, I couldn't shake the awareness of his presence, the way his voice seemed deeper, more commanding, or how his gaze lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. He even shifted in his seat, resting his chin on his hand as he watched me. You seem different, Aunt Claire, he said after a moment, his tone curious. Quieter than usual. Everything okay? He hesitated, his question striking closer to the truth than I was comfortable admitting. I guess I've just been a little tired lately, I said with a shrug. Greg's been traveling a lot and the house feels too quiet when I'm here alone. Stephen's brow furrowed, his expression softening. His words caught me off guard and I blinked at him, unsure how to respond. It's just part of his job, I said finally, though the excuse felt hollow, even to me. Stephen leaned back, his jaw tightening. Still, he should make time for you. You're worth it. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening at the sincerity in his voice. There was something about the way he said it, as if he truly believed it, that made me feel seen, in a way I hadn't in years. Thanks, Stephen, I said quietly, my cheeks warming. The conversation shifted after that, moving to lighter topics, funny anecdotes from his classes, stories about his friends, but the words he'd said stayed with me, echoing in the back of my mind. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself relaxing in his company. Stephen had always been easy to talk to, his quick wit and easygoing nature a welcome distraction from the weight of my everyday life. But today, there was an undercurrent to our interactions that I couldn't ignore. A subtle tension that made the air between us feel charged. At one point, he leaned forward to grab a bottle of water from the coffee table, and his hand brushed mine. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't explain. My breath hitched, and I quickly pulled my hand away, hoping he hadn't noticed. Sorry, he said, his voice low, his eyes searching mine. It's fine, I said quickly, forcing a smile. But my heart was racing and I could feel the blush creeping up my neck. Stephen sat back, his expression unreadable, and for a moment the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I focused on steadying my breathing, willing the moment to pass, but the tension lingered, heavy and undeniable. Do you remember when we used to play board games here? Stephen asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I laughed softly, grateful for the shift in focus. Of course, you used to get so competitive. He grinned, the tension easing as he leaned back in his chair. And you always let me win. I hated that. I didn't always let you win, I protested, though the smile tugging at my lips gave me away. You were just too stubborn to lose gracefully. Stephen laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and for a moment it felt like old times. But as our laughter faded, the quiet returned, and with it, the awareness of how much had changed. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the room. I glanced at the clock, surprised at how much time had passed. I should start dinner, I said, rising from the couch. Need any help? Stephen asked, standing as well. No, you relax, I said quickly, needing a moment alone to collect my thoughts. But Stephen followed me into the kitchen, leaning against the counter as I began pulling ingredients from the fridge. You don't have to do it all, you know, he said, his voice quiet. I glanced at him, my brow furrowing. Do what? Take care of everything. Everyone. His gaze was steady, his tone soft but firm. You deserve to be taken care of, too. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. My hands stilled, the vegetables I was chopping forgotten as I met his eyes. For a moment, I saw something there that made my heart skip. A tenderness, a protectiveness that felt far too intimate for what we were supposed to be. I looked away, my cheeks burning as I forced a laugh. You're sweet, Stephen, but I'm fine. Really. He didn't respond, and when I glanced at him again, his expression was unreadable. The moment passed, but the tension remained, simmering beneath the surface as I finished preparing dinner. We ate in relative silence, the clinking of utensils against plates the only sound in the room. Stephen made a few attempts at conversation, but my responses were short, distracted. I couldn't stop replaying the moments we'd shared that afternoon. The lingering looks, the accidental touches, the way his words seemed to pierce through the walls I'd built around myself. When dinner was over, Stephen offered to help with the dishes, but I waved him off, needing space to clear my head. As he left the kitchen, I leaned against the sink, the weight of the day pressing down on me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew better. Something had shifted between us, something I couldn't ignore. And as the evening stretched on, I found myself wondering what would happen next, and whether I was ready to face the consequences. Another night rained down on my waiting person. All things considered, this really didn't seem that far-fetched. After all, the house settled into a quiet stillness as night fell, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards the only sounds breaking the silence. Stephen was in the living room, sprawled out on the couch with a book, while I lingered in the kitchen under the guise of cleaning. In truth, I was avoiding him, or more accurately, avoiding the way I felt when I was near him. I had told myself all through dinner that the tension between us was a figment of my imagination, a byproduct of my loneliness and his newfound maturity. But the way his gaze lingered on me, the way his words seemed to carry double meanings, made it impossible to dismiss. Eventually, though, I couldn't avoid him any longer. I dried my hands on a dish towel, took a deep breath, and stepped into the living room. What are you reading? I asked, forcing a casual tone. Stephen looked up, his face lighting up with a smile. Just something for class, he said, holding up the cover. It was a dense-looking psychology textbook, the kind that made my eyes glaze over just looking at it. I sat down on the opposite end of the couch, keeping a safe distance between us. Sounds riveting, I teased. He chuckled, setting the book aside. It's not so bad. Some of it's actually pretty interesting. Like what? I asked, genuinely curious. Stephen leaned back, his arm draped over the back of the couch. Well, there's this whole section about human connections and how we're hardwired to seek them out, even when it's inconvenient or complicated. It talks about how we're drawn to people who make us feel seen and understood, even if they're not the right person. His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I shifted uncomfortably under his gaze. And that's interesting, I said, my voice faltering. He tilted his head, studying me. You ever feel that way? Like someone just gets you, even when you don't want them to? I froze, the weight of his question pressing down on me. My mind raced for a response that wouldn't betray the chaos swirling inside me, but all I could manage was a weak shrug. I guess everyone feels like that sometimes. I whispered, trying to concentrate. Stephen's gaze didn't waver, and I felt myself sinking under the intensity of it. It's a powerful thing, he said softly, to feel seen. The air between us grew heavy, the unspoken tension crackling like static electricity. I stood abruptly, desperate to break the moment. I should check on something upstairs, I said, my voice shaky as I retreated from the room. Upstairs, I paced the length of my bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. What was happening? This was Stephen, my nephew, my family. The connection I felt with him was nothing more than a byproduct of my loneliness, I told myself. It couldn't be anything else. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the way my pulse quickened when he looked at me, or the way his words seemed to linger in the air long after he'd spoken them. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts, and I froze. Aunt Claire? You okay? Stephen's voice was muffled through the door, but the concern in it was clear. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob as I debated whether to answer. Finally, I opened the door just enough to see him standing there, his expression unreadable. I'm fine, I said quickly. Just needed a minute. He nodded, but he didn't move to leave. I didn't mean to upset you earlier, he said, his voice low. I care about you. And I hate seeing you like this. Like what? I asked, my throat tightening. Like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, he said. You deserve to be happy, Aunt Claire. The sincerity in his voice was almost too much to bear, and I felt my resolve crumbling. Stephen, I started, but the words caught in my throat. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. You don't have to say anything, he said softly. I just wanted you to know that I see you. That's all. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. His words hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for, and I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Thank you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He reached out as if to touch my arm, then seemed to think better of it and let his hand fall back to his side. Good night, Aunt Claire, he said, his gaze lingering on mine for a moment before he turned and walked away. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the day in my mind. My thoughts were a tangled mess of guilt, confusion, and something I didn't dare name. The next morning, I found Stephen in the kitchen, making coffee. He looked up as I entered, his smile warm but cautious. Morning, he said. Morning, I replied, avoiding his gaze as I poured myself a cup. The tension from the night before still lingered, though neither of us acknowledged it. Instead, we made polite conversation about the weather and his plans for the day, both of us tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. But as the morning wore on, I found myself drawn to him despite my better judgment. His presence was magnetic, his laugh infectious, and I couldn't help but feel a spark of something that both thrilled and terrified me. By the time he announced that he had to leave, I felt an inexplicable pang of disappointment. Thanks for letting me crash here, he said as he gathered his things. It was nice spending time with you. It was nice having you here, I said, my voice tinged with sadness. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze locking onto mine. I'll be back soon, he said, his tone almost a promise. As I watched him walk out the door, I felt a knot of emotions tightening in my chest. I told myself that this was just a fleeting moment, a temporary lapse brought on by circumstances. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something had changed between us, and there was no going back. The following week was quiet, almost too quiet. With Greg still away for work, the house felt emptier than usual, and I found myself replaying Stephen's visit more often than I cared to admit. His words, his lingering glances, the way he made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years, it all lingered in the corners of my mind like an uninvited guest. I threw myself into the usual routines, cleaning, errands, work. But the memory of Stephen was a stubborn undercurrent I couldn't escape. The sharp, undeniable truth was this: I missed him. The thought left me breathless with guilt and confusion. He was my nephew, family. Yet I couldn't deny the spark that had ignited between us, unspoken but powerful. It was early Saturday morning when I heard my phone buzz on the kitchen counter. Groggy from a restless night, I picked it up and saw Stephen's name on the screen. My heart leaped, a mix of anticipation and apprehension surging through me. Hey, Aunt Claire, are you free today? Thought I could stop by if you're not busy. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard as I debated my response. Logic told me to decline, to put distance between us and let whatever this was fizzle out. But my heart, traitorous as ever, urged me to say yes. Sure, I'm not doing much. Come by whenever. His reply was immediate. Be there. In an hour. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. What was I doing? I had no idea what I hoped to accomplish by seeing him again. Maybe I just wanted clarity, a chance to confront whatever this was and put it to rest. Stephen arrived right on time, his familiar smile disarming as ever as he stepped through the door. He looked casual, yet put together, in jeans and a fitted t-shirt that showed off the definition he'd gained in college. Hey, he said, his voice warm. Thanks for letting me come over. Of course, I replied, forcing a smile as I stepped aside to let him in. The atmosphere was lighter than his last visit, at least at first. We chatted easily over coffee, slipping into the familiar rhythm of our conversations. But as the morning wore on, the undercurrent of tension began to creep back in, subtle but unmistakable. At one point, Stephen leaned against the kitchen counter, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. You've been on my mind a lot lately, he said suddenly, his voice low. I froze, the coffee cup in my hand trembling slightly. Stephen, I know it's wrong, he continued, his eyes searching mine, but I can't stop thinking about you, about us. There is no us, I said quickly, though my voice lacked conviction. His expression softened, and he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Then why does it feel like there is? The air between us grew heavy, charged with unspoken emotions. My mind raced, torn between the logic screaming at me to push him away and the ache in my chest that wanted nothing more than to pull him closer. Can't do this, I whispered, taking a shaky step back. Why not? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because it's wrong, I said, my throat tightening. You're my nephew, Stephen. This isn't... It can't happen. He nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. I get it, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. I don't want to make things harder for you. He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. I just needed you to know how I feel. For a moment, we stood in silence, the weight of his confession pressing down on both of us. I didn't know what to say, how to navigate the impossible situation we'd found ourselves in. And then, I should go, he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Oh, no, I blurted out before I could stop myself. Don't go. He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. I sighed, struggling to find the words. I don't want things to end like this. You mean too much to me. His expression softened, and he stepped closer again, his hand brushing against mine. Then let me stay, he said quietly. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I simply nodded, my heart pounding as we stood there, closer than we'd ever been. The rest of the day passed in a haze. We stayed in the living room, watching movies and talking about everything and nothing, but the tension between us never fully dissipated. Every accidental touch, every lingering glance, felt like a spark, threatening to ignite the unspoken emotions simmering beneath the surface. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Stephen turned to me, his gaze serious. Can I ask you something? Of course, I said, though my heart raced at the intensity in his voice. Are you happy? He asked, his eyes searching mine. The question caught me off guard and I hesitated, unsure how to answer. I don't know, I admitted finally. I guess I've been so busy keeping everything together that I haven't really thought about it. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. You deserve to be happy, he said softly. Stephen, I started, but the words caught in my throat. I mean it, he said, his voice firm. You deserve more than just getting by. You deserve to feel alive. His words hit me like a tidal wave, stirring something deep within me that I'd buried long ago. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze, as tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. You should go, I said finally, my voice trembling, before this gets even more complicated. Stephen hesitated, his jaw tightening. If that's what you want, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. It's what I need, I said, though my heart ached at the words. He nodded slowly, then stood and gathered his things. Goodbye, Aunt Claire, he said softly, his voice filled with a sadness that mirrored my own. As I watched him walk out the door, I felt a mix of relief and regret. I had done the right thing, I told myself. I had put an end to something that never should have started. But as the house fell silent once more, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me had left with him, and that I might never get it back. The days that followed Stephen's visit were a blur. I went through the motions of daily life, but everything felt muted, like the world had lost its color. Every time I walked past the living room, I half expected to see him there, sprawled on the couch with that easy smile that made my chest tighten. But he wasn't there, and he wouldn't be. I told myself it was for the best. Whatever had been building between us, it needed to stop before it spiraled out of control. But logic didn't dull the ache in my chest, or the constant replay of his words in my mind. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, my phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, my heart skipping a beat when I saw Stephen's name. Can I see you? He said. I stared at the message, my pulse racing. I should have said no. I should have ignored it. But my fingers betrayed me. What? Now? I'm outside, he said. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I walked to the window and peeked through the curtains. Sure enough, his car was parked at the curb. his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. My first instinct was to turn off the lights and pretend I wasn't home. But something in me wouldn't let me. Against my better judgment, I opened the door. Stephen stood there, hands shoved into his pockets, his expression a mix of determination and vulnerability. "Hi," he said softly. "Hi." "Hi," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Can we talk?" he asked. I hesitated, glancing over my shoulder at the empty house. Greg was still away on another business trip, and the silence inside felt deafening. I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. We sat across from each other in the living room, the space between us feeling both vast and suffocating. Stephen leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly. He seemed nervous, a stark contrast to his usual easygoing demeanor. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," he began, his voice steady but quiet. "About what I said and how it made you feel?" I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Just let me say this first," he said. "I know I crossed a line, and I'm sorry if I made you uncomfortable. That was never my intention." "Stephen," I said, my voice trembling, "you don't need to apologize." He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. "But I do. Because the truth is, I can't stop thinking about you, and I don't know how to deal with it." Words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. My heart ached at the raw emotion in his voice, and I felt my carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. "I feel it too," I admitted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "But it's wrong, Stephen. We both know that." He nodded, his jaw tightening. "I know, but it doesn't change how I feel." The room fell into a charged silence, the weight of our emotions pressing down on us. I stood abruptly, needing to put distance between us before I lost control. "You should go," I said, my back to him. "I can't," he said, his voice breaking. "I can't just walk away from this, from you." I turned to face him, tears streaming down my face. "You have to, Stephen. This can't happen. It'll ruin everything." He stood as well, his expression anguished. "Then tell me you don't feel anything for me and I'll leave. Tell me this is all in my head." And then I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him what he wanted to hear, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself stepping closer to him, drawn by an invisible force I couldn't resist. "Stephen," I whispered, my voice trembling. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine, and the spark that ignited between us was undeniable. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the gap between us. Our lips met in a kiss that was equal parts desperate and tender, a release of all the emotions we'd been holding back. His hands cupped my face, his touch gentle yet firm, and I felt myself melting into him. Time seemed to stand still as we clung to each other, the world outside fading away. For that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the consequences, not the guilt, not the impossibility of what we were doing. All that existed was us. But reality came crashing back far too quickly. I pulled away, my breath coming in ragged gasps as the weight of what we'd just done settled over me. This can't happen," I said, my voice breaking. Stephen looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "I know," he said softly, "but I don't regret it." His words sent a fresh wave of emotion crashing over me, and I turned away, unable to face him. "You need to go," I said again, my voice barely audible. Stay, as he did. He hesitated, but eventually I heard the soft shuffle of his footsteps and the quiet click of the door closing behind him. I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands, as the tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. The house was silent again, but this time the emptiness felt unbearable. I knew I'd made a mistake, one that could never be undone. And yet, a part of me couldn't bring myself to regret it, no matter how much I knew I should. The kiss had been a turning point, a moment that would define everything that came next. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. Now I had to face the consequences, whatever they might be. The next few days were a blur of conflicting emotions: guilt, confusion, longing. I barely left the house, too consumed by the whirlwind in my mind to focus on anything else. My heart and my head were locked in a battle I couldn't seem to resolve. I knew I should call Stephen, tell him that what had happened between us was a mistake that could never happen again. But every time I picked up the phone, my resolve faltered. I wanted to hear his voice, to feel the warmth of his presence, even if it was wrong. It was late in the evening, just as I was beginning to convince myself to call him, when my phone buzzed. My heart leapt, half hoping and half dreading that it was Stephen. But when I glanced at the screen, it wasn't his name I saw. On my way home, be there in an hour, Greg said. And then the message hit me like a bucket of cold water. Greg hadn't been due back for another 3 days. Panic surged through me as I realized how unprepared I was, not just for his return, but for the reality of facing him after what had happened with Stephen. I rushed around the house, tidying up and trying to banish the lingering traces of Stephen's presence. The coffee mug he'd used was still sitting in the sink, and a faint trace of his cologne lingered in the living room. I scrubbed, sprayed, and opened windows, desperate to erase every sign that he'd been there. By the time Greg walked through the door, I had managed to compose myself, or at least I thought I had. He looked tired, but pleased to be home, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder and his tie loosened. "Hey," he said, his voice warm as he pulled me into a hug. "Hey," I replied, forcing a smile. We settled into our usual routine, small talk over dinner, catching up on his trip. Greg seemed oblivious to the turmoil raging inside me, and for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything might go back to normal. But that illusion was shattered the next morning. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee, when Greg walked in with his phone in hand. "Hey, do you know why Stephen called me last night?" he asked casually. There was a moment's pause before answering. The cup slipped from my hand, clattering onto the counter and spilling coffee everywhere. "Stephen called you?" I asked, my voice strained. Greg nodded, his brow furrowed. "Yeah, he left a message. Said he needed to talk to me about something important." "Did he mention anything to you?" My mind raced, panic clawing at my chest. Why would Stephen call Greg? Did he mean to confess? To tell him what had happened between us? "No," I said quickly, forcing my voice to remain steady. "I haven't talked to him." Greg studied me for a moment, his gaze searching. "You sure everything's okay? You seem a little off." "I'm fine," I said, turning away under the pretense of cleaning up the spilled coffee. "Maybe he just wanted to catch up with you." Greg shrugged, apparently satisfied with my explanation. "I'll call him back later," he said, setting his phone on the counter. I nodded, but inside my anxiety was spiraling out of control. What was Stephen planning to say? I couldn't focus on anything for the rest of the day. Every time Greg picked up his phone, My heart leaped into my throat, terrified that he was calling Stephen. The minutes dragged into hours, each one more excruciating than the last. Finally, late in the afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped away to the bedroom and grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed Stephen's number. He picked up on the second ring. "Aunt Claire?" he said, his voice soft but cautious. "Stephen?" I whispered, glancing over my shoulder to make sure Greg wasn't nearby. "Why did you call Greg?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could hear him take a deep breath. I didn't mean to scare you," he said finally. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I needed to talk to him." My heart sank. "Stephen, you can't." "I didn't tell him anything," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I would never do that to you, but I thought maybe if he knew how unhappy you are, he'd try harder. I thought it might help." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, a mixture of relief and frustration washing over me. "You don't understand," I said, my voice breaking. "You can't fix this. You can't fix me." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment I thought he might have hung up. But then he spoke. His voice low and filled with emotion. Before I could respond, the bedroom door creaked open and Greg stepped inside. I quickly ended the call, my heart racing as I slipped the phone into my pocket. "You are against all this," I said. "Who are you talking to?" Greg asked, his brow furrowed. "No one," I said quickly, my voice too high-pitched to be convincing. "Just a telemarketer." Greg's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press the issue. "Dinner's ready," he said finally, his tone neutral. I nodded, forcing a smile as I followed him out of the room. But my mind was racing, a storm of emotions threatening to consume me. The next day, Greg announced that he was working from home. Normally, this wouldn't have bothered me, but today it felt like a ticking time bomb. If he decided to call Stephen, everything could unravel in an instant. I spent the day on edge, jumping at every sound, every movement. Greg seemed oblivious to my anxiety, focused on his laptop and phone calls. But as the hours wore on, I noticed him watching me out of the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable. By the time evening rolled around, I was a nervous wreck. Greg set his laptop aside and leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on me. "Claire," he said, his tone serious, "is there something you're not telling me?" The question sent a jolt of panic through me, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "You've been acting strange ever since I got back," he said, "and I can't shake the feeling that something's going on." My mind raced, searching for an explanation that would satisfy him without giving anything away. "I've just been stressed," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Greg studied me for a long moment, his gaze piercing. "Does this have anything to do with Stephen?" The blood drained from my face, and I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Greg's expression darkened, and he leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "What's going on, Claire?" My heart pounded in my chest as I scrambled for an answer, the weight of his suspicion bearing down on me. I had managed to keep the truth hidden this long, but I could feel the walls closing in, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could hold them up. The air between Greg and me felt suffocating. His eyes bore into mine, sharp and unrelenting, demanding answers I wasn't prepared to give. My hands trembled as I set my coffee mug on the table, the soft clink sounding unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent kitchen. "Claire," Greg repeated, his voice firmer now, "is there something going on with Stephen?" I shook my head quickly, too quickly. No, I said, forcing the word out even though it felt like a lie caught in my throat. Nothing's going on. I don't know why you'd even ask that. He bent down and kissed my forehead. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, his expression skeptical. Because you've been acting strange since he left, and because he called me the other night saying he needed to talk about something important but wouldn't tell me what. Now you're jumpy and distant, and I can't help but feel like I'm missing something. My stomach twisted into knots as I struggled to maintain my composure. I don't know why he called you, I said, my voice trembling. Maybe he just wanted to check in. Greg stared at me for a long moment, his gaze unyielding. Are you sure about that? I nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, I'm sure. Greg didn't press the issue further, but the tension in the house was palpable. I could feel his eyes on me whenever I wasn't looking, could sense the doubt simmering just beneath the surface. He was suspicious, and I knew it was only a matter of time before he started digging for answers. That night I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, as my thoughts spiraled out of control. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Stephen's face, his earnest expression, the warmth in his eyes, the way he'd looked at me as if I were the only person who mattered. The memory was both a comfort and a curse, a constant reminder of the line I had crossed. Beside me, Greg shifted in his sleep, his arm brushing against mine. The contact made me flinch, guilt washing over me in waves. He didn't deserve this, I told myself. He didn't deserve the lies, the secrets, the betrayal, but no matter how much I wanted to undo what had happened, I couldn't. The damage was done, and there was no going back. The next morning, Greg announced that he had to step out for a meeting. It shouldn't take too long, he said as he grabbed his keys. I'll be back by lunch. I nodded and squeezed his hand. I nodded, forcing a smile. Okay. Drive safe. As soon as the door closed behind him, I let out a shaky breath. The weight of his suspicion momentarily lifted. I grabbed my phone and hesitated before dialing Stephen's number. He picked up almost immediately. Aunt Claire? He said, his voice tentative. Stephen, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We need to talk. There was a pause on the other end of the line before he spoke again. Okay. When? Now, I said, glancing at the clock. Greg's out for a meeting. Can you come over? I'll be there in 10 minutes, he said without hesitation. True to his word, Stephen arrived quickly, his car pulling into the driveway just as I opened the front door. He stepped inside, his expression a mixture of concern and relief. Is everything okay? He asked, his eyes scanning my face. No, I said, closing the door behind him. Everything's a mess, Stephen. Greg knows something's wrong. He's suspicious, and I don't know how much longer I can keep this up. The longer it goes, the darker it becomes. Stephen frowned, his jaw tightening. Did he say anything? Does he know about us? Us? No, I said quickly. But he's asking questions, and I think he suspects there's more to your call than you let on. Stephen sighed, running a hand through his hair. I didn't mean to make things harder for you. I didn't know what else to do. I nodded, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. I know. But we can't keep doing this, Stephen. It's not fair to Greg, and it's not fair to us. He stepped closer, his expression softening. I don't care about fair, he said, his voice low. I care about you. My breath hitched, the weight of his words pressing down on me. Stephen, please, I said, my voice breaking. We have to stop this before it goes any further. He reached out, his hand brushing against mine. Do you really want me to walk away? He asked, his eyes searching mine. I hesitated, my heart and my head waging a war I couldn't win. It doesn't matter what I want, I said finally. This isn't about us. It's about doing what's right. Stephen's hand fell to his side and his shoulders slumped. If that's what you want, he said quietly, his voice filled with resignation. It's what I need, I said, though the words felt like a knife to my chest. He nodded slowly, then stepped back toward the door. Goodbye, Aunt Claire, he said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. Goodbye, Stephen, I whispered, watching as he walked out of my life for what I hoped would be the last time. The house felt emptier than ever after Stephen left. The silence was deafening, a constant reminder of what I had lost. But I knew I had made the right decision, even if it was the hardest one I'd ever made. Greg returned a few hours later, his mood lighter than it had been in days. He kissed me on the forehead and asked how my morning had been, his suspicion seemingly forgotten. I clung to the normalcy, desperate to believe that everything could go back to the way it was before. But deep down, I knew the truth. Nothing would ever be the same. The days that followed Stephen's departure felt like wading through a fog. I went through the motions of daily life, laundry, errands, small talk with Greg. But nothing felt real. Each moment felt like I was performing a role, reciting lines in a play that no longer made sense. In the quiet moments when I was alone with my thoughts, the weight of what had happened pressed down on me. Stephen's words, his touch, the way he had looked at me with such raw emotion, it was all seared into my memory. No matter how hard I tried to push it away, it lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the line I had crossed and the pieces of myself I had lost along the way. Greg, for his part, seemed to have let his suspicions go. He was back to his usual self, preoccupied with work, his mind often a million miles away, even when we were in the same room. Part of me was relieved that he hadn't pressed further, but another part of me felt an ache of longing for something I couldn't name. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window at the moonlit street. The house was silent, save for the soft rhythm of Greg's breathing as he slept beside me. I glanced at him, the man I had built a life with, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it took my breath away. What had happened to us, to the love we had once shared? I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when things had begun to unravel, but somewhere along the way, we had drifted apart, our lives running parallel but never truly intersecting. I thought about Stephen, about the way he had looked at me as if I were the only person who mattered. It was intoxicating, that feeling of being seen, of being wanted. But it was also dangerous, and I knew that if I let myself dwell on it for too long, it would consume me. The next morning, I decided to clear my head. I told Greg I was going for a walk, and he barely looked up from his laptop as he mumbled a distracted, "Okay." The crisp air felt like a balm against my skin as I wandered through the neighborhood. My thoughts were still a jumble, but the rhythm of my footsteps provided a small measure of comfort. I found myself at the park where Stephen and I had spent time when he was younger. Memories flooded back, laughing as we fed the ducks, pushing him on the swings, watching him run ahead with boundless energy. He had been just a boy then, full of innocence and joy. Sitting on a bench, I let the memories wash over me, my heart aching with the weight of what we had become. A voice interrupted my thoughts, and I looked up to see Mrs. Henderson, an older woman who lived a few houses down, walking her dog. "Claire, dear," she said with a warm smile, "it's been ages since I've seen you out and about." I forced a smile, nodding politely. "Just needed some fresh air." She sat down beside me, her dog settling at her feet. "Is everything all right? You seem preoccupied." I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Just a lot on my mind," I said finally. She nodded knowingly. "Life has a way of throwing us curveballs, doesn't it? But you're strong, Claire. Whatever it is, you'll get through it." Her words were kind, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. If only she knew the truth, I thought. When I returned home, Greg was still at his laptop, engrossed in his work. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him, wondering if I would ever find the courage to tell him the truth. But what would be the point? Telling him would only hurt him, and it wouldn't change what had happened. It wouldn't erase the feelings I had for Stephen, or the guilt that weighed on me like a stone. As the weeks passed, I threw myself into the routines of daily life, hoping that time would dull the edges of my guilt and regret. I avoided Stephen's calls and messages, knowing that speaking to him would only reopen wounds I was struggling to heal. But no matter how hard I tried to move forward, the memories lingered. I would catch glimpses of him in the corners of my mind, his smile, his touch, the way his eyes had lit up when he looked at me. And with those memories came questions I couldn't answer. Was it possible to feel something so real, so powerful, and have it mean nothing? Or had it meant everything? A fleeting moment of connection in a life that had grown stagnant and unfulfilling. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the bedroom, Greg came in and sat on the edge of the bed. He was quiet for a moment, his hands clasped in his lap, before he spoke. "Claire," he said, his voice hesitant. "I know things haven't been easy lately." I looked up, my heart sinking. "What do you mean?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I mean us. We've been distant, and I can't help but feel like I've let you down." The vulnerability in his voice took me by surprise, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Greg, you haven't—" "I have," he interrupted, his gaze meeting mine. "I've been so caught up in work and everything else that I haven't been the husband you deserve." Tears welled in my eyes as his words pierced through the walls I had built around myself. "It's not just you," I said, my voice breaking. "I've been distant too, and I've made mistakes. Mistakes I can't take back." He reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "Whatever it is, Claire, we'll get through it together." The sincerity in his voice was both comforting and painful, a reminder of the love we had once shared and the damage I had done to it. As I looked at him, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could continue to wallow in guilt and regret, letting it consume me, or I could try to rebuild what we had lost. "I want to try," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Greg nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "Me too." That night, as we lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess of hope and fear. I didn't know if we could fix what had been broken, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't felt in a long time: possibility. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the shadows of the past would linger for a long time. But as I lay there, Greg's hand in mine, I realized that I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The following weeks felt like walking a tightrope, each step precarious, every word carefully chosen. Greg's attempt to bridge the gap between us had been earnest, and for a while I allowed myself to believe that things might return to some semblance of normalcy. But the weight of my secret was ever present, a constant reminder of the fractures beneath the surface. I hadn't heard from Stephen since our last conversation, though I couldn't blame him. I had pushed him away, told him it was over, and he had respected that, but his absence was its own kind of ache, a hollow space in my chest that refused to be filled. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves began to fall in fiery hues, I decided to clean out the attic. It was a task I'd been putting off for years, but the act of organizing and discarding felt symbolic, a chance to purge not just the clutter of my home, but the chaos in my mind. As I sifted through boxes of old photos and forgotten trinkets, I came across a shoebox labeled Memories. Inside were mementos from my earlier years with Greg, movie ticket stubs, handwritten notes, and a collection of photos capturing moments of joy and laughter. Looking at those pictures, I barely recognized the people we had been. Carefree, happy, in love. Tears blurred my vision as I clutched one particular photo, a candid shot of Greg and me at the beach, his arm wrapped around my shoulders, both of us grinning at the camera. What had happened to us, to that couple who had once been so full of hope and possibility? That evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I felt the weight of my guilt pressing down on me like never before. Greg was chatting about his day, his tone light, but I could barely focus on his words. The urge to tell him the truth, to unburden myself, grew stronger with each passing moment. "Greg," I said suddenly, cutting him off mid-sentence. My voice trembled, and I set down my fork, unable to meet his eyes. "There's something I need to tell you." He looked at me, his brow furrowing in concern. "What is it?" My heart pounded in my chest as I searched for the right words. "I haven't been honest with you," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. I've made mistakes I regret." Greg's expression shifted, confusion giving way to a guarded intensity. "What kind of mistakes?" he asked, his tone cautious. Well, tears spilled down my cheeks as I finally met his gaze. "It's about Stephen," I said, my voice breaking. "Something happened between us, and The sound of his chair scraping against the floor cut me off. Greg stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Stephen?" he said, his voice rising. "What the hell are you talking about?" I stood as well, my hands raised in a futile gesture of supplication. "It wasn't what you think," I said quickly. "Nothing physical happened, but there were feelings I shouldn't have had." Greg's face was a storm of emotions: anger, betrayal, disbelief. "Feelings?" he spat. "You're telling me you had feelings for my nephew?" "Yes. I didn't mean for it to happen," I said, my voice trembling. It happened. And I ended it as soon as I realized what it was. I swear." Greg stared at me, his chest rising and falling with the force of his breaths. "I trusted you," he said, his voice shaking. "I trusted both of you." "I'm sorry," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry, Greg. I never wanted to hurt you." But my words felt hollow, inadequate in the face of his pain. He shook his head, his jaw tightening as he turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there. alone and broken. Gray didn't come home that night. I spent hours pacing the house, alternating between despair and self-recrimination. I wanted to call him, to beg him to come back, but I didn't know what I would say. There was no justification for what I had done, no way to erase the damage I had caused. The next morning, I found a note on the kitchen counter. I need some time to think. Don't call me. Greg. The words felt like a punch to the gut, but I couldn't blame him. I had shattered his trust, and it was up to him to decide whether he could ever forgive me. Days turned into weeks, and Greg remained distant. He would come home occasionally to pick up clothes or paperwork, but our interactions were brief and strained. The house felt emptier than ever, each room echoing with the silence of what we had lost. When he did face to face with me, I thought about Stephen often, wondering if he knew what had happened, if Greg had confronted him. Part of me wanted to reach out to apologize for dragging him into this mess, but I knew it would only make things worse. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, my phone buzzed. My heart raced as I picked it up, my breath catching when I saw Stephen's name on the screen. "Are you okay?" he asked. I stared at the message, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. After everything that had happened, he still cared enough to check on me. But as much as I wanted to respond, to tell him everything, I knew I couldn't. "I'm fine. Please don't contact me again." The words felt like a knife to my chest, but I hit send before I could change my mind. It was the only way to move forward, to give Greg and me a chance at rebuilding what we had lost. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into therapy, determined to understand the choices I had made and the consequences they had wrought. It was a painful process, unearthing the buried insecurities and unmet needs that had driven me to seek validation in the wrong places. But it was also freeing, a chance to confront the parts of myself I had long ignored. Greg remained distant, though he eventually agreed to attend a counseling session with me. It was awkward and uncomfortable, but it was a start. A small glimmer of hope in the darkness that had consumed us. Months later, as the first snow of the season blanketed the ground, Greg and I sat together in the living room, the silence between us no longer heavy but tentative, like a fragile bridge we were slowly building. He reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that we might find our way back to each other. I entered his apartment, my heart thudding in a tune we'd not yet found comfortable. The scars of the past would always remain, but I had learned an important truth. Healing wasn't about erasing the pain, but learning to live with it, to grow from it, and to strive for something better. And now, as I looked at Greg, his face etched with the lines of both hurt and hope, I realized that I was ready to try, to face the future, whatever it might hold, with honesty, courage, and the resolve to never lose myself again. As I sit here, reflecting on the chaos of the past few months, I find myself caught between regret and resolve. Life has a way of surprising us, of leading us down paths we never thought we'd walk. And yet, here I am, forever changed by choices I never imagined I'd make. Stephen was a spark in the darkness, a reminder of a part of me I had long buried, the desire to be seen, to be understood. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. But that spark came with a cost, a fire that threatened to consume everything I held dear. I made mistakes, big ones, ones I'll carry with me forever. And then there's Greg, my husband, the man I promised to share my life with. He wasn't perfect, and neither was I. Somewhere along the way, we both let the distance between us grow until we were strangers living under the same roof. But Greg is also the man who, despite everything, looked at me with forgiveness in his eyes, a forgiveness I didn't deserve but desperately needed. I don't know what the future holds for us. Rebuilding trust is a slow and painful process, and I'm not sure if we'll ever fully get back to where we were. But I know this: I'm committed to trying, to owning my mistakes, to being honest, even when it's hard, to loving myself enough to never lose sight of who I am again. And whenever I do, as for Stephen, I hope he finds his own path, free from the shadow of what happened between us. He deserves that much. We both do. And though I'll always carry the memory of him with me, it's time to let go. Time to move forward. If life has taught me anything, it's that we are shaped by our mistakes as much as our successes. The choices I made have changed me, but they have also forced me to confront the parts of myself I had been avoiding for far too long. It's a painful lesson, but one I needed to learn. So here I am, standing at the crossroads of what was and what could be, ready to take the next step. It won't be easy. It never is. But I've learned that the most important journey is the one back to yourself. To anyone listening to my story, this isn't the end. It's a beginning, a chance to rewrite the story, one chapter at a time. Until then, take care of yourself and never stop striving for the love and honesty you deserve. Goodbye.